All right, good to see you again. It wasn't that long, was it? Good to see you again, guys. A lot of exciting things happening here at LifePoint, and not just building activities. Actually, later this year, there's a team from LifePoint going to work with refugees from around the world, North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Greece. We're in the final stages of finalizing that team, selecting that team, and getting everything going. I'm really excited. There's about 10 people that seem to be headed in that direction. So really excited about that. Some of you were on that trip 2 years ago with the church as we sent a team out to work with refugees in Greece. And the thing about refugee ministry, the thing about working with refugees is it's the coming together of a lot of people. Right? Sometimes our teams would be surrounded by hundreds, even thousands of refugees, big numbers, but also big needs. It's easy to lose track among all those faces, all the individual stories of loss and fear, things that have led people to flee their homes. The needs are real, and so when you have those big numbers and those big needs come together, it can be overwhelming. Some of you know my family worked for 5 years in full-time refugee ministry in Greece. And we've seen just that, the confluence of those big needs and those big numbers and just feeling overwhelmed. I remember on multiple occasions walking into the ministry center that we had there in Athens and just people everywhere and everyone calling your name, Mister, I need help, Mister, rice, oil, water, sleeping bag, Mister. People pulling on your sleeve everywhere you would go with real needs, legitimate needs. I can remember one particular day I went into our ministry center and was just swamped, overwhelmed by the needs around me. Everywhere I'd go, people tugging on my sleeve. Eventually, I was talking to a family about their needs, about what they had come to Athens, why they left their home country, and there are several other families around us, and they kept pulling on me and grabbing my sleeve and saying, sir. I said, no, wait, I'm talking to this family. Just give me a minute and I'll talk to you next, but let me talk to them right now. Another moment later, somebody's tugging on my sleeve, and I just kind of snapped around. I just kind of been overwhelmed, right? And I just kind of snap around. I say, can't you see? I'm talking to someone else. Wait. And then my heart sank because it wasn't that same family before. It was Majid. It was an 8-year-old Afghan. He was there in Athens with his dad, who was addicted to drugs. Their mom had passed away on the journey, and he had no safe place in this world, but he looked at that ministry center. He looked at that place as the one place where he was known and loved and where he was safe. And my heart just sank when I snapped, when I felt so overwhelmed. There's something when you're in a situation like that, when you're surrounded by chaos, when you're surrounded by needs and crises, that you can stop seeing people. You can stop seeing the stories and the real people in front of you and just see problems. Just everywhere you look, you see a problem and a problem and a problem, and they start to mount, and you start to have tunnel vision, right? You can't even see people as people anymore. And maybe in a different way you've experienced this, maybe at work, so surrounded with projects, so overwhelmed by different needs and things happening that it's easy to maybe snap at a coworker. Or maybe in the family with kids. If you've got multiple kids, if you have one kid, like you know how those demands can sometimes just pile up. And we start to see the problem rather than the little people in front of us. Sometimes we can be that way even with our spouses. Can you relate? Have you been in those kind of situations before? When we're in chaos, when problems seem to mount and overwhelm, it's easy for us to see only the problems and not the people. This morning we're going to continue our series called When Love Comes to Town. And we're looking at what happens when Jesus shows up. How he turns things upside down, right side up, we should probably say. And the way that changes everything. Join me in Mark chapter 6. If you have one of the house Bibles, you can join me on page 841. Mark chapter 6, we're going to start in verse 31. If you have your own Bible, you can follow along on the screen behind. We've been in this series working through Mark's gospel, this account of the life and ministry of Jesus by one of his earliest followers, a guy named Mark. And we read and saw from the very beginning, if you've been following along in our series, that Mark he's a real burden to help us see Jesus clearly. He wants us to see Jesus as the king come down from heaven. The king come down from heaven to rescue his people. And so in chapter 1, Mark introduced us to Jesus as a king. He showed us his coronation and said, you're invited into the story. You're invited to be a part of this kingdom. God's doing something new. And as we've continued to work through this series, we've seen that Jesus is the sort of king who brings us a rest beyond circumstance, beyond the things that the world can offer. He's the sort of king who, even as we saw last week, goes through storms and seas and mountains and faces down evil itself to rescue his people, to rescue even one. He's the kind of king who sees through even our wants down to our actual needs, to what our heart needs. And this morning, as we think about being overwhelmed, as we think about being surrounded by crisis, Jesus is going to show us a better way. Let's read together Mark chapter 6, verse 31. Jesus had just sent out his apostles, and they've come back after teaching, after having seen the crowds, shared the good news of the kingdom. And when they come back, they're overwhelmed, they're tired. And so Jesus in verse 31 says, and Jesus said to them, come away by yourself to a desolate place and rest. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. I mean, can you imagine? They're so swamped. They're so overwhelmed by people in need, people that are asking for something, people that just want to hear a word out of his mouth. They can't even eat. So Jesus takes this team of apostles and he wants to debrief with them. He wants to get away for a moment. So he takes them out to a solitary place. Verse 32, and they went away on a boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns, and they got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Now, if you're at all in leadership, and I mean that just very broadly, if you're leading in your family, if you're leading at work, if you're in business, you know that when people are looking to you, when they're looking to you for direction, they're looking to you for answers, for clarity, it doesn't take but a moment for it to feel overwhelming. There's always someone that needs some attention, always someone tugging on the sleeve of your arm, so to speak. And it's easy in that moment. You've probably felt this. It's easy in that moment to let the tyranny of the urgent, it's called sometimes, the tyranny of what's right in front of us, what seems urgent, to overwhelm us and to keep our eyes off of what's truly important. It's easy in those crisis moments where there are needs all around us to misprioritize our time or our values. It's easy in those times to see problems and not people. And so Jesus here in verse 34, this is why it so strikes me, because he did something completely opposite what I do. He had compassion on them. He didn't respond to these crowds who were, imagine this. Jesus went out in a boat with his disciples to go along to the other side to get some quiet, and the people in the villages recognize where they're going and they beat them there on foot. He can't get a moment of quiet, and yet instead of getting annoyed, instead of getting embittered or sarcastic or angry, like we might be so quick to do, Mark tells us that Jesus had compassion on them. I know that's not my default when I'm feeling overwhelmed. That's not my default when I can't get away, can't seem to catch my breath. And yet Jesus had compassion on them. It's a really interesting word in the Greek here. I try not to nerd out on the Greek too much, but this one I think is very interesting. It's this word splagnizomai. Greek can be a little bit like German. I know German, more people have studied that. You just kind of smash as many letters together as you possibly can, right? And so Greek can be like that. Splagizume. Try it. It's a fun one to say, actually. Splagizume. And if you participated in that, do a favor to the person sitting in front of you. Just kind of wipe the back of their head, because most likely that's like a sneeze word, you know. It kind of comes out with it. It's guttural. But this word in its origin referred to guts, innards. Actually, the inner part of an animal sacrifice was described with this word, splagnizomai. And by Jesus' time, it come to be described as compassion, but not just kind of a nice feeling, a soft sympathy in our hearts, but a gut-wrenching compassion. The kind of movement that we feel when our hearts ache because we see one of our children going off and down a self-destructive path, and there's nothing that we can do but let them learn the hard way. The kind of gut-wrenching compassion we feel when a loved one is going through pain and there's nothing that we can do to intervene. This is the kind of gut-wrenching, heart-breaking compassion that Jesus had. Faced with the crowds, faced with so many personal crises, so many people in need, Mark tells us that Jesus did something breathtaking. He had compassion on them. And that in and of itself stirs me enough, because I know that so much is not me. But Mark tells us why. He says that Jesus had compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, if you've traveled, I know there aren't a lot of sheep that roam these parts of the world, but if you've traveled, maybe you've seen sheep on the hillside. And if you see a sheep that's wandered off a little bit, you don't get mad at the sheep. That's what sheep do, right? You say, hey, little buddy, what are you doing here? But maybe after a moment you could say, well, where's the shepherd? Who's supposed to be watching you? Who is overseeing you? Jesus is moved to compassion. His gut is wrenched. His heart aches because he sees his people. He sees the very people of God without a shepherd. They're lost, they're wandering, they're in need, and there's no one there to tend to them. Throughout the ancient Jewish world, this picture of a shepherd has actually been a metaphor for leaders, for spiritual leaders in the life of God's people. And so let's not be too quick to just buzz by Mark's statement here that Jesus saw they were like sheep without a shepherd. Let's not be too quick to move on, because I believe that Mark is actually inviting us into the greater story of God and his people, this long story of God's faithfulness and God's provision to his people. You see, Mark wasn't the first to make an observation like this, that God's people were like sheep without a shepherd. In fact, I'm going to suggest to you today that Mark is fully intending that as his original audience reads this, his original audience who knows the Old Testament, as they read this, they step into a time warp, right? It's like the literary equivalent of a flashback scene in the movies. You read this and that phrase sounds familiar. This language is familiar, sheep without a shepherd. And I'm going to suggest to you today that Mark would have our eyes be drawn to Ezekiel chapter 34. Now, Ezekiel was a prophet who spoke on behalf of God. God sent prophets to the ancient nation of Israel to lead them and to guide them in his direction, to correct them, to encourage them. And Ezekiel was one of those who spoke on behalf of God to the people. In fact, we read in Ezekiel chapter 34, I'll just summarize some of it for you here. He tells him to prophesy. God tells Ezekiel, prophesy or speak against the shepherds of Israel. There were spiritual leaders in Israel. There were leaders who should have been overseeing God's people, who should have been caring for God's people, But here we're going to hear God's heart for justice because they are being neglected. They're not being cared for. They're being ignored and overlooked. And God says, I can't stand it anymore. And so just hear some of the ways that God lambasts. He doesn't hold anything back. And taking these so-called shepherds to task. He says, first of all, you don't feed the sheep. Listen, you're around there, you're getting fat, you're eating, shepherds of Israel, you're eating the choicest sheep, and you're not even feeding them. You don't care about them at all. You don't feed the sheep. And in fact, the sheep are wounded. They're hurting. You don't care for them. You don't bind them up. You don't draw them near and comfort them. In fact, under your watch, shepherds, the sheep have wandered off. They've been scattered. What kind of shepherds are you? God speaks. Ultimately, he says, you are no shepherds at all. Ultimately, Ezekiel, speaking on behalf of God, says that my sheep are without a shepherd because you guys aren't even shepherds. But God says that, no, I will step in. This cannot stay. God's heart of justice, God's heart for the overlooked, God's heart for his people is on display here. He says, I can't stand idly by. And so this verse, Ezekiel 34, verse 15, he says, I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep. God says, when I see my sheep without a shepherd, when I see my sheep scattered and hungry and hurting, I will step in. And I think Mark wants us to have this in mind. Mark doesn't need to include this piece about Jesus' compassion or that he saw them as a sheep without a shepherd. But he does it to key us in to who Jesus is, to what he's about to do. I think today some of us may need to hear this because it can often feel like in life, like we're overlooked, like we're going through anxiety or fear or pain or loneliness. And we're all on our own. And it's so easy in those moments to hear and to listen to the whispers of Satan who said, yeah, you got what's coming to you. Hey, what a mess you've made. God must be so ashamed that you would even call yourself his follower. And to those whispers and to those doubts that he casts in our heart, this text and Jesus himself says, no, hear this. God is a loving and compassionate shepherd. When he sees his people in need, he acts. When he sees his people hurting, he binds up their wounds. When he sees the sheep lost, he goes out and he finds them. He himself will be our shepherd. Mark wants us to have this in mind as we read the remainder of this story, this account. Join me in verse 35. Let's pick up the rest of what Mark would have us understand here. He sets the table, and then we read in verse 35. And when it had grown late, Jesus' disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send away these people. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and the villages and buy themselves something to eat. You can almost hear that shepherding language again. The disciples, not quite with it yet, are saying, let the sheep fend for themselves. Send them out, they'll find something. Jesus, what can we do? Send them out. And Jesus replies, you give them something to eat. They say, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread? It's almost a sarcastic question. We're talking about $20,000 or $30,000. Should we go buy $30,000 worth of bread and give it to them to eat, Jesus? Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. And they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And when they all ate and were satisfied, then they, the disciples, took up the 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Jesus isn't a shepherd who sends the sheep out to wander, sends them out to care for themselves, who says, hey, I'm busy, I've got a lot on my plate. He's not the kind of shepherd who snaps and says, just wait your turn. But moved with compassion, he leads them to green pastures. Moved with compassion, he loves and cares for the sheep. 5 loaves, 2 fish, and he feeds 5,000 men, just the men, let alone women and children that may have been there. That's pretty remarkable. And for some of us, we read that and we're so used to hearing this story, or we're so used to hearing similar stories, we can read right past it without a second thought. But I know for some of you here too, we read that passage, that story, and it just seems so unbelievable. For some of us, this is exactly the sort of passage that really we find hard to swallow, because it's so far outside of our experience. It's so far outside of what we know. It's so far outside of the norms of physics. 5 loaves, 2 fish, 5,000. I mean, you can put that in your calculator how many different ways you want. The math doesn't work out. And this idea that Jesus would do a miracle, that could be hard to swallow for some of us. In fact, I know very few people who have rejected Jesus because of his teachings, because of his morals, because of what he said to go love your neighbor or love even your enemy. But I know a lot of people who've come to a passage like this and they've kind of choked on it. I don't know what to do with this. This is so far outside of what I know, so far out of my experience. It almost seems unbelievable. In fact, some of us might say, this is a step too far. I think, actually, this is exactly Mark's point. This should be challenging to us. This was not a naive thing where the first century pre-modern people just naively accept whatever anyone told them. Instead, what Mark is saying is, this is incredible. This is beyond the laws of physics as we know them. This is beyond what we easily experience in our day-to-day lives or what's easy to believe. But what Mark is doing here is giving us a declaration. This passage is not about the value of sharing, right? Maybe you hear that sometimes. Well, look, people shared their bread. And this value is not about bringing, or the story is not about the value of just bringing whatever you got and letting God multiply. Those truths may well be accurate, but what Mark wants to do here is wave a flag and just declare clearly who this Jesus is. This Jesus, the kind of king that he is Lord. He is God in flesh come to live among us. He is not subject to the laws that we are subject to. He doesn't do things the way that we do them. When you follow him, you will experience things that we can't quite compute, that just don't make sense to us, because he is Lord. He is the God who with a word spoke creation into existence. This is the God with a word flung the stars into the sky, the vast majesty of which our astronomers are still watching and trying to see where they might end and see that their expanse is endless. With a syllable, he shapes and carves the mountains and hollows out the seas. This is the God who created all that there is in you and me, and he's not to be contained in our little boxes. And Mark wants to wave the flag and say, this is who Jesus is. He is powerful. He is overwhelming. He is Lord of everything. What kind of king is Jesus? Look, he's not that powerful king that stays up in his castle, that has all the power and just looks down on the servants, just looks down on everyone else in their need and stays far away and keeps himself clean from the messiness of life. No. Jesus is the kind of king. He's a shepherd king with great power, the Lord of creation itself, who can make things out of nothing. And yet he's come near as a compassionate shepherd to use that power to bless the flock, to care for those in need, to bind up the wounds of his sheep, to draw them near to his chest and to bring comfort, to feed and to love. This is the kind of shepherd, this is the kind of king that Jesus is. This morning, I pray that as we read Mark's account of Jesus as king, as we read about this powerful king who has come near to show us the loving hand, who has come near to be God himself shepherding his people, that you would hear that good news when you're hearing the whispers of Satan. Say, God doesn't care about what you're going through. If he cared, he would do something. Look, you've made this mess, live in it, you fix it. God must be so disappointed with you. When you hear those whispers, hear this shout that Mark wants us to hear about Jesus, that Jesus is the loving, compassionate, powerful, mighty Lord who has acted on behalf of his sheep, who's acted on behalf of you and I. And he has come near even when it cost him everything. He came near because he was God. Came near even in the mess of our sin and our brokenness, and joined us here, and even went to a cross to stand in the place of us, for our sins and in our place. It's this Jesus who's given it all, powerful and compassionate for you, that you might know God's great love, that you might know that God has not abandoned you or forgotten you, but he's come to gather together the flock and to bring near to him the sheep, to pull them close to his chest and bring comfort and healing. He's done that for you. This morning, as you hear Mark's account of who this Jesus is, what kind of king this Jesus is, I ask and I pray, run to him. He is good.